Welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're in the middle of class 42 about Jesus and the feasts of the Jews. In the first part of the class, we talked about what were the spring feasts for the Jews and began to do some connecting between those feasts in the time of Jewish history and also Christian events in the time of Jesus and then later on. And what I'd like to do is just kind of review this a little bit with a little bit different kind of graphic. And that is this one that shows the holidays grouped in spring and fall as we're discussing them. You already see that we've covered Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first fruits and Pentecost. And so you have then all the teaching that we did to connect them with Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and then the coming of the Holy Spirit and the new covenant on Pentecost. Okay? And so if you look at the spring feast of the Jews, and you compare them to the Christian history, then you see that the first four feasts have been fulfilled during the first coming of Jesus when he came to the earth. And so if you look at the feast again that occurred every year, compared to the events of the Christian calendar through history, then the feasts and their meanings that have yet to be fulfilled would be the fall feast of the Jews, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a major feast. And so if this graphic holds true, then what will happen is that in the events at the end of the world, then we'll have events that are parallel to the teaching and the meaning of the fall feast for the Jews. So let's look at some of these. The first is what they call Rosh Hashanah, which literally means head of the year or the new year, found in the passages again that you see there. The Hebrew name, Yom Teruah. And basically, it's the Day of Trumpets. It's a call to repentance, and also it's a call to judgment. And so at this time then, you have the idea that, at the end of the world, it talks about the trumpet sounding, and then people will have to appear before the throne of God. Okay? And then it says after that, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 and following, one of my favorite passages, talks about what will happen then at that time that the trumpet sounds. And the part that I like the best is in verse 17, we will be caught up together with them in the cloud to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Love that part. And then 1 Corinthians 15:52 talks about, again, that context about a trumpet and all these things happening in a twinkling of an eye, in a flash. And so again, we have these events of the Day of Trumpets. And then we have the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and again, it's found in Leviticus chapter 23. And this has an interesting history to it. If you go back and read how the high priest and the people were supposed to celebrate this day, they would select 2 goats by lot from among the goats in the camp. And they would take one of those goats and they would call it the goat that was dedicated to God. And they would sacrifice that goat to God for the people. And then the other they would call the scapegoat. And they said that it received the lot of Azazel, which is kind of a strange term in the Old Testament. One of the meanings of it even is assigned to the devil, if I understand it correctly. And so the high priest takes this goat, the scapegoat, and lays his hands on its head, and then he confesses over the goat all of the sins of the people that they've committed during that year. Not necessarily one by one, but talking about presenting the sins in a block, the sins of the people for the year. And then once he's done that symbolically, then he sends the scapegoat with all the sin of the people out of the camp, outside the camp. And the idea is that it's supposed to stay out there forever, wander in the desert. And as you see in this picture, there's a suggestion by some scholars that the man who takes the goat out to make sure that it doesn't come back with all the sins of the people, he pushes it off a cliff, maybe. And so that way, there's no way it can come back into the camp and bring back the sin. So again, if you look at Jesus in the context of this one, then you have Jesus really as both. He's sacrificed for the Lord, but he's also the scapegoat that receives all the sin of the people and is sent outside the camp. And you see that imagery when he's outside Jerusalem as he's crucified on the cross. And so again, this Day of Atonement has to do also with the events at the end of the world. And you have the second coming of Jesus, right? The first time in history that he comes as a lamb that is sacrificed for the people. And the second time he comes as a lion. He comes as a lion, as a victorious person. He comes as one who is powerful. He comes as one bringing judgment. And you wonder if this isn't more the Jesus that John the Baptist expected when he talked about him coming with fire and an axe and a winnowing fork and judgment, purifying. This may have been more what he thought, and this is the time when everyone will be brought to judgment. So you have that. And then the third feast of the fall, we want to spend some time teaching about because there's a lot in this one. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or in Hebrew, the Feast of Sukkot. And the name actually comes from the practice they had during this feast of remembering their time in the desert when they would live out in the desert. They didn't have houses that were built out of stone. They didn't have permanence. They lived moving from one place to another. They lived in tents or almost in booths. And so during this feast, they would build a booth out of sticks or poles and then branches from trees. Just a really simple thing. And they would call it a sukkah. And their families would live in it. They'd remember their time in the desert when God took care of them. And then at the same time, during this feast, they celebrate the harvest that's just been gathered in. Okay? And so it's a time of remembering how God provided for them in the desert and how he's just provided for them now with the harvest. It's a time when they know now we're in the promised land. And so again, there's rejoicing, the season of our joy. And the plural for sukkah, the booth, is Sukkot in Hebrew. And so again, that's why this is called this feast. Now, there's an interesting set of words or connections here because one of the questions people have about Jesus' birth, and we talked about this briefly in that class, was when did he come to earth? Not only the year, but also what time of the year did he come? Probably wasn't at Christmas in December. There's a hint, perhaps, in John 1:14 when it talks about, and the Son of God, the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. And the word for dwelt or lived, inhabited, is to tabernacle among us. And so it's interesting that if he's actually born around September, and there's several biblical clues that point toward that month, then that's also the same month as the Feast of Tabernacles. And so when it says Jesus came and tabernacled among us, it was almost the same thing as saying he came during the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths. And he came during a time when people are waiting for the promised land of heaven. And so that could be an interesting connection there as well. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Feast of Tabernacles that we know about in the book of John. Actually, the events of John 7 through 10 are all connected in some way with the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, about in August, September of the year. Now, in chapter 7, verse 10, we see that after his brothers have gone up to Jerusalem, that he also goes up to Jerusalem. And then John 7:14 tells us he begins to teach in the temple. And again, that's a very common thing for the rabbis to have done, to take time during the feast weeks of Jerusalem to teach their disciples, especially about Jerusalem as the city, about the feast themselves, and then what all of these things meant. And one of the things that happened during the Feast of Tabernacles that was pretty interesting is the water ceremony, okay? And in general, here's what would take place. There was a priest that would take a golden jar from the temple, and then the people would form up behind the priest in a procession, and he would go from the temple down the hill all the way to the pool of Siloam. And if you remember in John 9, right in the middle of this block, that's the very same path that the blind man would have taken when Jesus sent him down to the pool of Siloam to wash his eyes and then begin to see. And so it's interesting, he has the priest on the procession. Everybody goes, and the blind man goes by himself. So the priest gets to the pool of Siloam, and he fills the golden jar with water, and then they turn around and go back up the hill, and it's a pretty steep hill, all the way to the temple, and they go to the altar, and the priest pours out the water on a silver dish at the altar. And during all this time, it's not just silent. There's flutes are playing. There's a chorus who's repeating Psalm 118, and then a trumpet announces the entrance of the priest to the temple as he comes in and then pours the water onto the silver dish at the altar. And the whole idea during this Feast of Harvest is to thank God for his provision and ask for rain for the coming months as well. And so again, this water ceremony focuses on the key role of water in the life of the Jews. Literally, they would die if they didn't get water to drink, and also to provide for the harvest each year. And so it's brought about at this time, most likely, when this water ceremony is going on, maybe when the priest has brought the water back in and he's pouring it on the temple. And it says here in verse 37, John 37, it says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, when this water ceremony took place, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as scriptures has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. And so it's interesting that in the middle of all this focus on water, then Jesus calls out and says, if you're really thirsty, then come to me, and I will give you rivers of living water. Okay? And so you think about what John says here is the meaning. It says the Holy Spirit is the living water which purifies us, and perhaps if those streams of living water flow out from us, then they can also bless other people and purify them as well. And so once again, Jesus takes something that's customary for hundreds of years for the Jews to do, and he gives it new meaning, just like he does at the Last Supper later on. Okay, now, if the Jews are paying attention to this and thinking about the role of water for them and their nation and their history, then they might be thinking about other important allusions to water in the Old Testament from their history. For example, one possibility would be Ezekiel chapter 47. So let's go back there and read that. Ezekiel 47, beginning in verse 1. And it says, the man brought me back to the entrance to the temple. This is Ezekiel and a vision that he's having about the temple that is to come. And I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me around to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then led me through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was up to the waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river I couldn't cross because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, Son of man, do you see this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, which is the valley of the Dead Sea, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the water flows. There will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. Now, if you look back on this passage and you think about the water itself, that's the key feature here that connects the temple over to the Dead Sea. The water is coming from where? It's coming from out underneath the temple area, underneath the altar. So in other words, it's really coming from the temple itself, where the presence of God is. And then it goes all the way down into the Dead Sea, which is notorious because nothing grows there, nothing lives there, completely salty to this very day. And it says that at this time, then this water flowing from the temple, from the presence of God, is going to make that water fresh again. And so again, the Jews normally understand this as a messianic prophecy, that when the Messiah comes back, even the Dead Sea then will become fresh again, and fishermen can fish on the shores. All right? And so the Jews, looking backwards to Ezekiel, know about this prophecy, and then they're looking forward to the time of the Messiah. And so Jesus says, come to me if you want, if you're thirsty and you want water to drink, and there will be rivers of living water flow from within you, which is really similar to flowing from God in the temple. And where's the water going to come from? It's going to come from the Spirit, the Spirit of God. And so again, there's these connections to Ezekiel 47. Now, before we leave that idea, let's go straight from Ezekiel 47 all the way to the end of the Bible in Revelation 22. And if you have verses 1 and 2, listen to this and think about Ezekiel 47. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And so it's almost as if John is quoting from Ezekiel 47. You have the water of life, the river, flowing from where? From, again, the throne, the presence of God. So life comes from God through this water. You have trees on each side. In fact, it even says, on each side stood the tree of life. You kind of wonder how that looked. And it says it bears 12 crops of fruit, 1 every month, and that's exactly like Ezekiel 47. And it says the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations, just like Ezekiel 47. And so you have strong connections to the future as well. But at this time, in John 7, the Jews don't know anything about Revelation, obviously. And then you have the suggestion of Jesus as the living water that some might remember from the story of Jesus and the woman of Samaria by Jacob's well. He says, come to me and you'll have water and you'll never be thirsty again. So again, John at least is connecting chapter 4 and chapter 7 and the events there. Okay, so that concept of water and what it meant for the Jews is an important part of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, there's another concept that's important, and that's the concept of light. Okay, now in the history of Israel, you have light connected in several ways to the presence of God as well. You have the glory of God, the Shekinah or Shekinah, in the tabernacle that came when the tabernacle was finished and dedicated, and the presence of God comes to rest on the temple in this blinding glory. Then the good Jews would also remember the pillar of light that guides the Israelites, which appeared for the first time in the desert. And then also you have the fire, which is a different kind of light that also guides the Israelites in the desert. Okay, so again, all these different kinds of light. And then it also would remind the Jews of when Solomon dedicated the temple in 1 Kings 8. And again, just as with the tabernacle, when it was dedicated and finished, when Solomon finished and dedicated the temple, then again, the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, comes and fills the temple. And that also happened during the Feast of Tabernacles. And so you have this strong connection all the time between light and the Feast of Tabernacles and these important events and the presence of God being symbolized by that light during this time. Okay? Now, if you look also at the area of the temple, This is the court of women right here, this kind of a square court. And it's also called the court of prayer because that's one of the main things that happened here. They said that during the Feast of Tabernacles, that they would put these 4 enormous menorahs right here. You see 2 of them right here, and there's 2 on the other side as well. We don't know if they were there all the time or just put in for the feast, perhaps. But according to what we understand about these menorahs, these huge candle stands, they were almost 86 feet high. So you're talking about like an 8-story building about or more. Each of the menorahs had 4 branches. These are a little bit different than the ones here. And each of the branches had pans, huge pans that they would fill with oil. In fact, each pan contained 60 gallons of extra virgin olive oil, the only kind that they would accept to burn in the temple, the purest kind. These pans were filled with this oil by the young priests. And then the young priests would take the old clothes that the priests wore the year before, and they would cut those into strips, and they would weave them together as wicks, and then they would climb up ladders to the top of the menorahs where the pans were, and they would light the oil with and use the cloth as the wicks. And it says, let me go ahead and change the deal here. This is, again, the idea of how large these are. And again, probably 4 with pans on top. So you can see the model is not exactly right here. But it says that when these menorahs were lit, they were just blazing beacons of fire. And since the temple was on the top of the highest point in Jerusalem, that when they were lit, that every house in Jerusalem received light from the temple. Okay? And so you think about that, and then you think about what Jesus says in the middle of this Feast of Tabernacles, again, in John chapter 9, also John chapter 8, and mentions also in John chapter 12 as well, 2 different times. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. So again, it's a visual that the Jews already know about. They've done for many years, and yet Jesus gives it a new meaning. He says, you see that light that gives light to all Jerusalem? Well, then I am the light of the world. And so again, just amazing connections that Jesus makes. And there's several things about the light that it does. The Jews know this. First of all, from the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1, you see that light is part of what brings order out of chaos. The light organizes the darkness, in a sense, there. The light also reveals for bad or for good what man has done. The light serves as a guide for people to know where to go and to make decisions that are important decisions for them. And then again, Jesus underlines the fact, I do all these things. I am the light. I'm the light of the world. Okay? Now, there's something that is even more interesting in a sense about light and about these candles, these menorahs. And it has to do with another feast that came in later on. This first Feast of Tabernacles is established hundreds of years before Jesus. But the Feast of Hanukkah, which is celebrated around Christmas for us, that started in about the year 160 BC. And the background is the victory of the Maccabees over their enemies against the Seleucids. You remember in about 163 BC, the Seleucids were continually and completely oppressing the Jews, and finally they had enough of it, and they rebelled, and they were led by the family of the Maccabees, especially their son Judas Maccabees. He was called the Hammer. And so they fought kind of a guerrilla war for about 3 years, and at the end of it, against all odds, they won the war, and they drove the Seleucids out of the country. And for about 100 years, then the Jews were in control of their own country, and they governed themselves. This is begun by the Maccabeans. And so when they won the rebellion, they wanted to rededicate the temple. And part of the rededication of the temple was to light candles with special oil so they could then rededicate it for a certain number of days, for 8 days. But then they found there was only 1 jar of oil that was consecrated, oil that they could use to do it. So you could only use consecrated oil. And they needed enough oil for 8 days. And so they lit the first candle with the only jar of consecrated oil they had, and then they began to consecrate the other oil, but that would take a number of days. But this oil that they thought would last for one day actually miraculously lasted for 8 days. And so the temple was consecrated in 8 days, as it should be. And so that event is remembered as the miracle of Hanukkah. And so after that, then, you have the Feast of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, because they were dedicating the temple. And this is actually mentioned in John 10:22, because by this time now, at about 30 AD or so, now it's been about 190 years since they started this feast. And so these customs were well established, okay? So the idea was that you would have this menorah with 8 normal candles, and that for the 8 days of Hanukkah, you would light 1 candle for each of the days, okay? But then they had a 9th candle, and you see here in this picture the 9th candle a little bit above the rest. And this 9th candle was called the servant light. And it was called the servant light because they would take this candle and they would go to the synagogue where there was lights burning already, and they would light this 1 candle from the lights in the synagogue, and then they would bring it over to the temple, and they would light the other 8 candles from the servant light. And the Jews believed that this servant light came directly from God. In other words, that God blessed it and God provided this light so that they could then celebrate the rest of Hanukkah. All right? So again, interesting story about the origins of this feast, not mentioned in the Old Testament because it came after the Old Testament. And so if you look at Jesus in the context of Hanukkah, or dedication, which the Jews were celebrating there in John 7 through 10, it probably happened maybe a month or two after the actual celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. But in the context of Hanukkah, or dedication, then Jesus is, first of all, the light that comes from God. Okay, when he says, I'm the light of the world, he's saying, I come from God. And then he's the light that lights the whole world, John 8:12 and John 9:5. Jesus is also the servant light. Remember Isaiah 42, Messianic prophecy says, this is my chosen servant. He's the servant light. And then he is the light that lights all the other lights. And so it's really just an amazing amount of teaching connected to the Feast of Tabernacles and then Hanukkah. And the amazing part is how Jesus fits together all of what the Jews already know and practice, and then adds another layer to it that kind of is the cap layer that really finishes off everything and brings it to fulfillment. And he says, everything that you've been preparing for, everything that you've been celebrating, is pointing to this moment, and I'm here among you, and I tell you, I'm the living water, and I'm the light. I am the culmination of everything that the Old Testament, all the feasts have been talking about. And so again, we see that if the Jewish feasts are supposed to be a precursor of the events of salvation history for God, we've already seen 4 of the 7 fulfilled, and the question is then, when will we see the other 3 fulfilled? Will they be fulfilled exactly in the same way that these others were? It wouldn't surprise me a bit. No one knows the day or the hour. No one knows how God's going to do that. But again, it's amazing how God uses these feasts to teach about Jesus and the future. And it could be that he'll do some more of that with the remaining events at the end of the world. Hope this has been helpful to you. It's interesting stuff. I enjoyed teaching it to you. We'll see you next time.